I quite like it when someone sort of picks up a drink and puts it down, and then the next square picks it up. And are you sharing that mug?
Yes, we could probably arrange something like that. You know,
I
handing
think
over
you
the
can
mug.
carefully coordinate and choreograph some sort of routine.
Yeah, I think we should do that for the next webinar. I'll hand a coffee off like this. You just take a coffee like that. Yeah. Or we can certainly have a pretend baton or something, you know, to hand around the panel when we're talking. I think we should definitely try and do something along those lines. We could get identical odd mugs that I hand off.
Yeah, you need to see.
I tell you what would be quite nice if we all had our own branded mugs, but we had like one of each. So you've got a BACP one, you've got a Heart Square one, and a Feline Soft one, and then we can drink them in rotation.
Yeah. But I definitely like the idea of saying, you know, you fancy a cup of tea, Shelley, and oh yes, so Chelsea. Sorry, I keep it's like I'm in the army, calling you by your surname. And then you take the mug that I'm handing you. Next time, that's what we'll.
Better planning.
Yes.
Better props for the webinar. Absolutely. Great. Okay, so I'm going to. I think we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for attending the webinar on selling your internal business case for technology projects. My name's Alan Reed. I'm the Director of Client Projects with Heart Square. I'm delighted to welcome our panel today, Chelsea Shelley and Ralph Johnson. Chelsea, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit, if that's okay?
No, of course. I'm Chelsea Shelley, currently the Chief Operations and Membership Officer at BACP. Have worked within membership bodies for the last 16 years, primarily in the membership and marketing functions, most recently at BACP. Previous to my current role, which I started at the beginning of this year, I was Head of Membership and Operations at BACP, which is where my involvement in the scoping and rollout of the CRM project came in.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And Ralph, do you mind as well, please?
Of course. My name's Ralph Johnson. I'm the Managing Director of Feline Soft, and we've been engaged with BACP for several years now, working across a number of their systems, which we'll find all about during this session.
Fantastic, thank you. So today's webinar is about agreeing a business case and technology roadmap before people do the fun bit, which is to rush out and go shopping and select new technology suppliers. It's one of the areas that people struggle with the most. So I'm very interested in hearing from Chelsea about how that worked at BACP. So great, let's get started. First of all, a couple of bits. Webinar etiquette. We're recording this session. None of your data is being recorded. The registration data is there purely for the registration, but just for politeness. We've then got the Q&A box for questions. We'll be hearing from Chelsea about the journey at BACP and raising the whole topic. Ralph has worked with lots of other organizations on the same journey. So where you've got questions for the panel, please put it in the Q&A box, which you'll see on the screen, and then we'll raise those questions at the end. If you're having any technical issues, you don't need to use the Q&A box for that. Use the chat box, and then one of the Heart Square team will help you on the chat if you have any technical or audio issues. And then otherwise, the usual stuff about microphones on mute. So Heart Square, I'll just say one thing, which is that we are fiercely, religiously independent of any technology or provider. So that means that we're able to advise on costs and implications across the whole technology set. Then we're racing ahead because we've already done the first one. The next one is setting out the challenge, which I'll do in a second. Why do organizations find setting out the business case and the roadmap so difficult? Then I'd like to ask Chelsea some questions about the journey at BACP. And we want to have the majority of the time for Q&A about your own project, your own challenges, what's going on with you as in your own organization, so that we can then address that as part of the webinar. Great, thank you very much. So the next bit then is setting out the challenge. And this is what we hear. So we at Heart Square work across around about 200 not-for-profit organizations. And we do something like maybe 15 or so business case and technology roadmap projects a year. And we keep hearing about the same challenges that organizations have. So first of all, as ever, it's helpful to define some terms. What do we mean by a business case? Now, very often the people on this webinar we find are the ones who are challenged, who are given the job. If you want to do something, if you want to make some change in the organization, you want to spend some money, you have to go off and create a business case. And you say, oh, right, well, I've never done one of those before. What's meant by that? So in simplest terms, it's answering that question there. Never forget that the business case is fundamentally about proposing a change, which means it's fundamentally about money. There are other things like resources and options, etc., but that's the fundamental one. And then the other way of putting the same question is, what's the best use of our money? And money equals resource as well. What's the best use of our money to be the most enabled version of ourselves? We don't have limitless budget. We don't have limitless time and energy. So how can we use what we've got to the best effect, to best improve our services to our members, to our supporters, streamline our staff processes, or be more competitive because other organizations are having a way on their toes with our members and our supporters, etc. So what's the best use to be the most enabled version of ourselves? Now, as part of any business case and roadmap bit of research or bit of thinking that an organization does, we find it's really important to address these points. So what does it mainly have to achieve? So number one is pretty straightforward. The organization has to make some decisions. So for instance, in the COVID world, organizations had to make decisions between hunkering down and getting cheaper tea bags and just hoping that the bad times would blow over, or other organizations chose that they would invest in becoming more digital and opening up new engagement channels and allowing staff to collaborate more whilst not being in the same room at the same time. So in order to make those decisions, organizations need clarity on what the costs and the options and the implications of each option are. The second thing that's often overlooked, and we want to talk about on this webinar, is in order to have any chance of success, a business case and roadmap needs to have unanimity. It needs to have buy-in, or your best go at unanimity. It's generally unsafe to presume that all directors in an organization have the same priorities. So an effort must be made to get alignment within the management team and other stakeholders in order for it to have a chance of success. And then the third thing that any kind of roadmap must achieve is to establish a foundation for the next thing that you're going to do. And a foundation is essentially making sure, if you were the person, putting yourself in the seat of the person who's going to deliver this program of change or be responsible for it in some way, a solid foundation for success would be making sure you've got the right amount of money, at least the right amount of money, making sure you've got proper resources and you're not setting out to fail because you haven't got enough people involved in it, making sure that expectations are set about how long it's going to take and what the realistic benefits are going to be. Those kind of things are a solid foundation for success. We see over and over that if you imagine two identical projects taking the same amount of time, taking the same amount of money, project A is a success and project B is a failure because of the expectations that were set at the very early stages about how much it was going to cost and how long it was going to take. If you get that wrong early on, you're almost doomed to fail from your project. So those are the main things that a business case and technology roadmap must set out to achieve. And then I'll just talk briefly about what the elements are that organizations should try and deliver with that. So we always have recognized, of course, that a business case technology roadmap must have what we call technical clarity. That means what are the options? How much would each option cost? What are the pros and cons of each option? What option are you recommending? So pretty straightforward stuff there. What we've come to realize over the last 5 years is that the second most important element, equally as important as the technical clarity, is the buy-in and alignment. So before you're presenting it to your trustees and saying, I'd like this frightening amount of money to do this stuff, please. If you haven't taken reasonable efforts to get your other stakeholders on board and to weave in their feedback and their concerns and allow them to challenge it and then get alignment, then unfortunately we have a Lone Ranger project, and that's equally set up to fail with having a poor set of technical clarity. So what we found is that 90% of nonprofits who are doing this for the first time, they focus purely on the first one. They go off and do some desk-based research to some technology suppliers. They don't give enough information to those suppliers. They're talking to salespeople and giving them a broad outline. They get a little bit of a view of money. Because they think they're canny, they add 30% to that, and then they present it to the board of trustees. And a solid 3 times out of 5, it doesn't turn into a project, doesn't go any further. And then if it does turn into a project, it's got very poor foundations. So don't put yourself in that camp. Accept that people don't agree, accept that your directors will likely have the very best intentions for your organization. You can believe that, but they'll have different views of how that should be achieved, where you should start, where the money should be spent, and so on. So you have to tackle that by iterative playback of the business case and working to get alignment. And then recognize that approval is hard. Let's imagine the box on the left with all your technical information is 100% correct. And it says, this is the amount of money you need. Getting your organization to approve large sums of money from within your organization is genuinely difficult to do. So recognize the challenge of getting approval and tackle your approvals process in parallel with your technical clarity process. It's got to be iterative. It's got to be based on buy-in and alignment. So don't forget that that organizational people side, or else you will really struggle. So what we then find are the main questions people are struggling to answer is, where do I start? All of these blobs represent problems that I have within the organization. I know I have all of these problems. How do I turn it into essentially a list of options, some costs for those options, and a roadmap that turns the blobs of problems into a sequence of things that can be done in parallel or can be done at the same time. So really, those are the challenges that organizations have, and those are the things that we find are important to deliver as part of the technology roadmap. So from there, just before we talk to Chelsea about the journey at BACP, I'd like to just ask everyone a polling question, if I may. So first of all, if I could just ask about your plans and effect on of COVID in your organizations. So I'm just launching that now. You should see a poll popping up in front of you. And if you could just describe for your own organization, do you think your organization's business model will change in light of COVID, particularly with events, CMS and CPD? That will be very interesting to hear. Okay, a few more seconds, and then I'm going to stop the polling. Okay, and I'll share the results. And that's interesting to see. The great majority of organizations do expect to become more online focused and to operate through different channels and in light of COVID. And of course, whether it's through events, CPD or LMS. However, there's a distinct minority who are saying no and are happy with the status quo. Maybe we'll come back to that in the Q&A. Great. Okay, so what I'd like to go through from there is to talk to Chelsea about the journey at BACP. Chelsea, do you mind just expanding a little bit about BACP and what you do for a living, or is that all right?
No, that's absolutely fine. So BACP is a professional body, a membership organisation with just over 50,000 individual members, largely UK based. And we sort of deliver everything you would expect in a usual membership organisation in terms of events in CPD, publishing resources, online resources and website, taking members through a membership application, through an accreditation process. So like I say, all the usual things you expect in an organisation.
Great, thank you. And do you mind, I know you've done some really major technology projects in recent years, which have involved some major organisational change projects as well. Do you mind just giving a verbal version of what the projects have been, let's say, over the last 4 years? Just listing and describing briefly what those projects have been. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's fair to say 5 years ago, BACP had a very old legacy system. We also had 2 main websites and a number of microsites. At the time they were developed, it was all, made perfect sense to have them separate. But what we were finding was actually it was becoming difficult that all of our information and content was spread over different websites. And coupled with this old legacy, I don't know if I could even call it a CRM really, a sort of old database that was slow and cumbersome and time consuming to extract information from, we sort of said, okay, we need to do something about this. So the 2 major projects that we embarked on together, because it was important for us that we combined this work so the 2 systems could talk to one another, was a revamp of our website, which involved pulling sort of 7 sites into one, alongside a major update of our CRM system.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you very much, Chelsea. So in terms of the journey at BACP, for the benefit of the delegates, could you describe what were the problems you were trying to solve? What were the drivers for change? Why go through all this stress and all of this expense and all of this work? So if you could describe the starting point, if you like.
I think it starts from attending days like this, and you're going to events and you're hearing people describe how they're using their member data to deliver these highly personalized services in this tailored way, or you're looking at these brilliant websites and you realize you have all of those same ambitions and you simply do not have the tools to deliver that. We absolutely understood the principles of a tailored service and a great user experience on the website, but we're very aware that we were really limited in being able to do anything to even get near that level without really changing the systems that we had. So it was a stressor. We had members finding our systems difficult to navigate. I think the old CRM system, if you call it that, was universally complained about by staff internally as taking a long time to use. There was a few people that were able to get data out of the system, but it was a case of writing quite long scripts to get that information. Because it was such an old system, the support that we had for that externally was starting to disappear. So I think it just got to a point where we had this great ambition of what we wanted to do in the association, but we didn't have the right tools, and it was really starting to creak.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder to everyone that you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and then we will address those a little later. So you're, as you say, using older legacy systems that weren't fitting the needs of the business, 7 different websites, you said. Yes, and staff complaining and external stakeholders complaining about the service. So at that point, you recognize there's a whole bunch of problems. How did you go about getting agreement with the rest of the management team on what to change, how much to spend, what order to do things? It's very difficult to get alignment on that stuff, as we talked about earlier.
It is. I think it was abundantly clear to those of us in either the member-facing teams or the operational teams that something had to change. I suppose there were other areas of the business that could see it less. We, I suppose, were fortunate at the time that when we embarked on this project, absolutely everyone was talking about GDPR. And we weren't entirely sure that our system and our data would stand up to scrutiny of the new GDPR guidelines. So there was a major driver of what we actually had to do and must do to be compliant with external guidance. And that coupled with aspirations from, I think, all of membership, all of senior management, that we wanted to be a real member-focused organisation. We wanted to deliver top quality service. So they shared the goal, and we were able to demonstrate that an effective CRM, an effective website was the way to achieving those goals. So I think it was a case of being very clear as to what we wanted to achieve in association, and then making the link between that end goal and how the technology could help enable that. And I think once we did that, people could see that, one, we had to do some of this work, but two, there were some real positives that we could bring about by doing it.
And that's really interesting what you say. So you made use, I know this is not the language you used, but you made use of what we might call a negative business case, which is GDPR, we have to do this stuff or else we're all going to jail. And I think there were some other negative business case elements as well, from memory, around security concerns and
yeah, the whole infrastructure, I suppose, was a cause for concern, I think it's fair to say.
Yes, and I think, you know, a word of advice to people is to make use of those negative business case elements as well as the positive business case elements. You know, we think the investment will derive these benefits and we'll be better off in this way, but also if we don't do it, we'll have these problems. I think that was something certainly that you did at BACP. And so how did you get agreement on, for instance, the costings element? That's always something people struggle with. How much money do we actually need? And then, oh my goodness, that's a lot. Why does it need that much money?
Yeah, I think there's a certain expectation that if you involve technology, that's going to be spending money. And for those that were less technical, it was really a case of breaking it down into what we were getting for each part of what we were paying for. And that was difficult to do because sometimes it wasn't clear that this much money buys you this. There was a lot of groundwork that needed to be done. But I think just sharing a very clear roadmap for delivery, breaking it down into a staged process really helped gain that commitment.
Great, thank you. And so that breaking it down and clarity on the costs and options was sufficient for the internal audience, from the sound of things, the management team, the board of trustees, if that's the right language at BACP. And once you have alignment on that, you're then in that scary position of, okay, guys, we approved this surprisingly large sum of money. It's now your responsibility to deliver some benefits from it. Step one on that journey, just to accelerate it a bit, was the search for new technology providers. So can you tell us a little bit about how you approached that? As you say, there were different problems online and the back office. So how did you go about searching with technology providers and of course getting your organization to agree on the right technology providers?
I think this was tricky for us. So the membership and marketing teams were really clear on what they wanted from a new system in terms of being member focused and how we deliver to members. But actually one of the first responses internally was from the IT team to say, we can build you something. And you sort of, okay. And they did go off and try and build something. And I think it was a conference similar to this, where it was highlighted that projects like this can fail when you're relying on internal teams to deliver something so big. And that was a bit of a light bulb moment of, hang on, what are we trying to do here? This is bigger than we can cope with. This is a major change project and we need some external help. And I think it was quite overwhelming at that point, because it was like, okay, we know we want to do this. We know we've got the money. Where do we start? What is it we want to achieve? And there's so many products out there and, you know, buy this, do this. And, you know, CRM was talked about a lot. So I think it was really helpful to us to find a partner who could guide us through that kind of mass of different suppliers.
Yes, because it's a minefield. And of course, everyone's saying they're the best and everyone's got different pros and cons and a track record and so on. So there was a little bit of a political element internally, or a little bit of hurting people's feelings then, which is another way of saying the same thing. internally. With if the IT team are saying, I can do it, I've done 7 websites already, I can do another one, and I can write a new system for you. Was that a difficult hurdle to say, well, no, we don't want to do that?
I think it was, and I think it was about the understanding of what the point of a website and CRM system was, because obviously they're technology projects, but they're not there to be owned by IT. It was really important that they were owned by the teams that were dealing with the processes or trying to serve the members, because those were the teams that had the expertise on what the system needed to do and how it needed to work and what they wanted to deliver. So just kind of going through those internal steps to say, of course, this involves technology, but it's important it's not owned by IT and becomes a technology project, because what you'll end up doing is building what your IT team can build. You won't be building what you actually need. So I think that was a real kind of culture shock in some ways, to get to the point of actually CRM and website are membership and marketing tools and not IT tools. But we did get there, and we understood that, and we kind of had strong voices within those membership and marketing teams that were able to help bring that across.
No, that's a fantastic point, because if people view it as a database replacement project, we've got this older thing, we're going to put in a shinier version of it, then essentially people will switch off. And by the way, very often trustees won't think it's worth spending the kinds of money, the sums of money that you really need to have a transformative project. Thank you. And then, so you then did your market research, you did your tendering process. How do you, as you say, there's a lot of different suppliers, they're all saying they're the best, etc. How did you go about selecting the right suppliers, and what was it that was the differentiator for BACP?
Yeah, so we interviewed quite a few, and of course all suppliers sort of sit down and go, we can build you anything you want to be built, and I'm sure they can. But I think what was really good, we ended up working with Feline-Soft, and I think what helped there was, first of all, they helped us think beyond what we currently did. So you mentioned before, this wasn't about recreating a newer version of what we already had. So Feline-Soft were very good at saying, but why do you do that? And sometimes we were able to give a really good answer, say, this is why we do it. And they were able to go, okay, that makes sense, we'll do that. And sometimes they would kind of go, but why? And we'd go, actually, we're not sure why either. And they go, right, that goes in the bin then, we do something different. So they were very focused on what is it you want to achieve rather than what is it you currently do. And they were quite honest with us. I mean, this process was quite brutal at times, because when you're talking about your processes externally, largely for the first time out loud, even as you're saying, talking through some of the processes, you're thinking, actually, this is a mad process.
You're describing like this through your fingers.
Yeah. And, we were kind of saying, well, we put this piece of paper in this drawer, and then and it's just like, okay, this needs to change. So they were quite good at sort of the brutal honesty, but in a very safe way, and in a way that was, don't worry, we need to get all this out on the table, because we're going to make it better and build you something that you actually need and does what you need to do. So I think in terms of that relationship there, I think what stood out was being very realistic about what could and couldn't be achieved. I mean, you could spend millions of pounds and have the most amazing thing, but this is your budget. What are your key priorities? What do we need to deliver first? And then being very honest. And I think as you work with a supplier as well, that trust continues to develop.
So thank you. And you mentioned some really important points there about trust and honesty. The relationship with the supplier is one of the things that we see very often being a challenge on these kind of projects. Partly, sometimes it's often because of poor foundations, not the right requirements, not the right level of ambition, not the right business case, etc. And sometimes it's because the power balance changes so much once the vendor selection has taken place and you spend a lot of money with that supplier. You're kind of locked in together at that point. It's no longer a master-servant relationship in any way. So what are the elements that you found to be important in having that successful relationship? And were there any adjustment pains that BACP had in getting used to being in project mode, if you like, as well as business as usual?
Yeah, absolutely. So BACP weren't necessarily used to working in an agile, flexible way. We sort of plodded along with all of our own workarounds in our current system. And although people had complaints about the system, change is also really difficult for people. So there was a lot of teething problems as you were finding, another organisations coming in, looking at your processes. And I think it's like with your family, you might know that they're slightly dysfunctional, but when someone else points it out, you're just slightly hurt. So there's that problem of kind of going through that with different teams. But it was great in that our supplier was able to not just spend time with those of us that were leading on the project, but also take the time to talk to individual teams, offer that reassurance. And I think that was important that they had their interaction with individual teams, so that everybody could see what was going on and felt a part of that process.
Yeah. And as I say, were there any adjustments that BACP had to make in getting into project mode and having colleagues fit this new way of working in with business as usual, because everyone's busy? No one's saying, I haven't got anything to do for days and days. How did all of that work, please?
We've realised pretty quickly that this wasn't something that was just going to rub along business as usual, that this was a commitment of time and resources. We actually introduced a role where that person more or less led on the project, liaised directly with Feline Soft. So they were sort of taken out of their business as usual and worked really closely on this project. And that helped because they sort of acted as a barrier between Feline Soft and the rest of the organisation, so that the organisation wasn't being bombarded or feeling too impacted, because we could filter it through, I suppose, the project manager essentially.
Great. And I think I've heard you talk about in the past that you actually went on some organisational training as well to equip your team and colleagues for this new way of working on the project. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So as I say, the agile way of project management was new to BACP. So it was just a case of a day or two sort of explaining what that meant to staff and helping them adopt some of those processes for this project. But it's interesting because actually we've retained some of that generally throughout the organisation. So it was very useful for this project, but it's also a skill that we've now embedded in the organisation. So that was well worth doing.
Great. And then we a very common question we get is around how does an organisation arrange itself? Its management team. One of our own research shows that one of the most corrosive things on a project can be the client's difficulty in making decisions. If a client can't make decisions about priorities and money and approvals, and then the supplier's in wait mode, that could be really difficult. How did BACP arrange your management team, project team, governance, decision-making framework to cope with all of that without getting overwhelmed?
So one of the first things we did was set up a project board specifically for this project, and that helped in a number of ways. It had a few managers in there, so it sort of got the buy-in from the higher level of management. It had a cross-section of teams from across the organisation, so all teams had sort of a representative who was involved in the project work, who could communicate back to the teams what was going on. It helped prioritise fairly. I think if every decision was left to me, of course I'd prioritise everything member facing immediately. So it made sure that it wasn't just my view of the project, that it was a fair and equal process, and we were able to have really robust discussions over prioritisation and what was done. And that project board remained in place for quite some time, actually. It's only recently that we've kind of dropped into a more fast-paced decision-making as we've got used to the project. But that was really useful just to, on a number of levels in terms of buy-in and communication and making decisions fairly. Great,
thank you. And I guess, it can't all be a walk in the garden, and you've made it clear it wasn't. Could you describe, so it's been a successful project, but can you describe perhaps a big project issue that you had? What was something that felt difficult at the time? And how did you work it through?
I think there were a few hairy moments, to be honest. I've spoken about us having quite an old legacy system. So one of the issues we had was our existing data, which had duplicates and mistyped info, and old data, and we didn't want to be pulling a load of rubbish data into a new system. So that was a difficult problem to solve, is how are we going to migrate this data? And we were lucky that we had a data specialist who was able to help that with that. But what we did really was a lot of testing, and that was really collaborative. So Feline-Soft would test and send across, we'd test it. And I think at that time, the communication was constant. It was all day, every day, chatting and making sure the data was right. And we got there, and that was great. I think go live was also a really scary moment. So this is the moment when you know you're turning off your old system, and you know it's secretly there in the background, but this is the day you've told all staff, we're going to press go, you're going to come in on Monday morning, ta-da, new system. And that was frightening and nerve-wracking, because you think you need to prepare staff, there's going to be a level of disruption if it all goes wrong. We had a really clear deadline. It slightly slipped, not hugely. But in a way that was okay, because we weren't pushing to go live before we were ready. We weren't being pushed to go live before we were ready. We were able to go, it's never going to be 100% perfect, but are we 99% there, and we're ready to do it? And we quite quickly got to that point, and kind of had that nerve-wracking moment. I kind of imagined a big green go button that was being pressed somewhere. But we came in, and it was up and running, and all of the testing and all the preparation had paid off, and we did it. But yeah, it was stressful leading up to that final stage.
Fantastic. We've got a load of questions coming in on the Q&A. And just a reminder, if people have questions about their own project or challenges, please drop them in. So looking forward then, as you say, the project, you had a go live, and a lot of people think of the go live as, well, now I can kind of collapse in a heap. Someone's going to put a Baco foil sheet around my shoulder and hand me a Mars bar, and it's, I can just have a rest. That happened. So how was it? What did you do after go live to maintain the momentum, to make sure you did get some benefits out of the project, as well as getting rid of the old stuff?
Yeah, so for us, it's very much a continuing journey. We knew at the point of going live, what we would have would be a new system that was compliant. We'd have a user-friendly website. There'd be certain processes that we absolutely needed to be working that would be working. We'd sort of started this journey, kind of seeing this kind of presentation of a really tailored member service, personalized service. We were really realistic that at go live, we weren't going to be at our final destination. At go live, we were going to have a functioning system. And then, although that's the most stressful part, actually the most exciting parts were what has happened since go live. So go live, up and running, big sigh of relief, this works, staff are using it, everyone's sort of bought into it. Now we're in a place where we can really start to do some interesting, useful things that are going to make things more efficient, that are going to save us time and save us money. And I think it's fair to say, had lockdown happened on that new system, we absolutely would not have been able to carry on working. We would not have been able to use that system remotely. Yeah. Members weren't able to do anything online. They weren't able to renew or apply. So if anybody had any lingering doubts about whether we'd gone to the new system, this has absolutely cemented that this was the right thing to do. And we have been able to continue working for the last 6-8 months with no disruption to members, because we put everything in place sort of the previous couple of years. But it's an ongoing journey. We're starting to now automate more of our processes. We're starting to tailor things much more specifically for members' needs. We're coming up to the point where we want to refresh our website yet again, and again add sort of more tailored personal service on there. So it's an ongoing process, but it's sort of like the nice to do, and the flourishes are now being added.
Fantastic. And then just a final question, then, if you don't mind, if one of the delegates were talking to you over a cup of coffee and saying, well, we're a few years in your rearview mirror. We're about to do this kind of project, either coming off older systems or major change to current systems. Do you have any kind of take homes that you would advise people on how to approach it? How to try and establish it for success?
I'd say, firstly, be realistic. It's really easy to see sort of, you see a website like Amazon promoting completely tailored things, you think, oh, we could do that. I think be really realistic. What is it that you absolutely must achieve, and how long is it going to take you to do that? And be in it for the long haul. You have to commit to these systems. You can't launch it and then walk away from it, because technology carries on developing and moving, and you have to continue to invest in that. And I'd say absolutely listen to the experts. We weren't tech experts. We really valued the expert advice and support we were given. But hopefully you'll be able to develop a relationship with your supplier where you can challenge as well. You know, you can acknowledge they are the technical experts, but you know, we have a really good relationship with FeelineSoft, and we can say, but why are you doing that? Or that isn't quite what we thought would happen. And so that relationship is really important, because I think that makes everybody feel a bit more secure, because you feel confident in challenging and asking the right questions.
Fantastic. Chelsea, thank you so much. And as I say, we've got a load of Q&A questions. I'm just going to launch another poll if we can take a moment to do that. So let me launch this particular poll here. What we're asking here is, do you have plans to invest in new technologies in response to what's happened with COVID? And you should see that poll in front of you now. If you could take a few seconds to answer it. Are you looking at improving what you've got, replacing, or both? And I'll just give it a few more seconds. But interestingly, almost half of the people, well, actually, I'll stop talking about it and I'll show you. If we look at the results, what we're seeing is almost half of the audience are looking at replacing current systems, which is a pretty stern indictment of people's systems around the membership and wider not-for-profit and charity sector. And then just over half are going to invest in their current systems. And you know, there's a strong crossover of both. A minority, only 8%, are happy with what they've got, or maybe another reason would be flat out don't have the funds to invest from where they are. So great, thank you very much for that, everybody. So what I'd like to do now then is to go through the Q&A. So I'm just going to ask my colleague George, if you don't mind, could you please let us have some of the Q&A questions, and people can carry on adding Q&A questions, and we'll then go through that, please.
Sure, no problem. Let me know if one of these questions have been covered by us speaking so far, and I can move on to the next one. So the first question is, how did you get agreement with trustees on how much to spend before doing the project?
I guess there's two parts to that as well. Thank you, George. For you, Chelsea, is how did you work out how much money you were going to ask for, and then and have confidence that it wasn't going to bite you later, I guess. And then how did you get it approved? Would you mind expanding on that a bit?
Yeah, so we'd gone out and we'd spoken to a number of suppliers to get a ballpark figure, really, because I think at the start of this we had no idea how much this was going to cost. So we got a few figures, and you know, they were broadly similar, and so we were able to go to the board and say, this is what we want to do, and this is, you know, this is the fact is this is how much it's going to cost. Like I say, there was a driver in partially, we had to do some of this to be compliant. And the other driver was they, as board members, were also members of BACP. So had probably experienced some of the frustrations that members were experiencing across. So they sort of had that, that vested interest in wanting to see an improvement in the organisation. And we were able to talk really realistically about, if we spend this much, we can do these things. If we spend a bit more, we can do more things. And it was really about kind of reaching an agreement with them about how much we wanted to spend, over how long, and what we would get for that. And, you know, if you spend a tenner, you're not going to be able to change much. If you spend a bit more, it's going to improve. So just being as clear as we could about what that money would deliver. And like I say, they were supportive of that.
Great, thank you. You know, again, that's often one of the biggest challenges organisations have, with trustees saying things like, well, my nephew did a website for £50. Why do you, why do you want this kind of money? So getting that agreed is a challenge. George, do you mind with the next question then, please?
Sure. So next up, we've got another two-part question. So what CRM and CSM combination did you go with? And what budget did you have to work with?
Okay, so we went for Microsoft Dynamics. That seemed to make the most sense to us. Staff were familiar with Microsoft, and the system we were on before was nothing like Microsoft, and so we didn't want to change to another completely strange system. It had some of the intuitive things that staff were used to in Microsoft, and it met all our needs. So it's Microsoft CRM. I feel like Ralph's going to have to help me with the website. I want to say Umbraco. Is what underpins it, but that's sort of getting into the technical area with me. That's right, isn't it, Ralph?
You are correct. It is Umbraco, yes.
And then in terms of how much you spent, I think it's a substantial amount that we spend on what we've done. In terms of a percentage of what we spend on projects, it's probably about 15% of our total project spend over a year.
Great. Thank you very much. And just on that then, BACP went for a single supplier across CRM and website. Was that always going to be the case? Did you think about options around that?
Yeah, we were really open to options actually, and we did speak to suppliers who did one or the other, and they talked about how they would then integrate. I think for us, it seemed easier to have a supplier that could deal with both. We knew that integration between website and CRM was really important for us. So that enabled us to do things like someone goes on the website and fills out a form, it populates the CRM system. I'm very aware that separate suppliers can make that happen, but it just felt easier to be talking, such a complex project as it was, it felt easier and more comfortable for us to just channel that through one supplier. Great,
thank you. And then can we do the next question then, please, George?
Sure. So next up, we've got, how do you go about finding the right supplier?
We weren't sure, and actually Heart Square were really useful in that we sort of gave them our brief, and I don't think it was probably a very refined brief to begin with, but it was just kind of, we need all of this and we want all of this, and they were helpful in finding the suppliers that were most likely to be able to meet that brief effectively, and we interviewed 3 or 4 suppliers at that point.
Great, thank you. And then, the next question is interesting. George, do you mind that's a good one from somebody.
Yeah. Do you have advice on how to establish trust with a supplier when their goal is commercial?
I suppose that's a really tricky one. You sort of enter into it sort of quite skeptically, thinking that they're just trying to sell us everything we need. I think partly that's the job of the supplier to convince you that they are trustworthy. And I think Feline Soft did that with us, because they didn't actually come in and say, yeah, we can do everything and we will do everything. They were very good at saying, do you want to do that? Why would you do that? And quite open, sometimes they would say, actually, it would cost you less if you did it this way. So it didn't feel entirely commercially motivated. And then I just suppose it's a case of, we've worked with Feline Soft now for 4 or 5 years. And so that trust builds as you go along the process.
I wouldn't mind answering that one as well. I would quite proactively say it does partly be determined by the commercial arrangements that you enter into with your supplier. I'm quite an advocate of agile, and I believe very strongly in aligning the incentives of both the supplier and the customer. In the case of the way that we work, I always believe that if you've got a rock solid spec that you've tried to nail down at the start of a project and you give that to a supplier, you create an adversarial relationship, because the second that you change that spec, which everybody does, it's just an inevitable part of life that change exists, then their job then is to charge you for that change. So they devote resources to proving that you've changed the spec over and above delivering the quality output. Whereas if your commercial arrangement is one of quality guarantee, so in other words, you say to them, well, we've got this objective, and if you can deliver great quality software for less, you make more money, rather than delivering a spec. And that's pretty much the fundamental difference between an agile commercial arrangement and a waterfall commercial arrangement. So just to put that into a nutshell, if Feline Soft can somehow magically deliver perfect code without any effort, then we make loads of money. If we fail to deliver great code, then we pay until that is of the right standard. So it really aligns the incentives between us and our clients.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful to hear. And the world has changed. I think most people would recognize it. The spec, as Ralph mentioned, it's moved away from must contain a surname. I must be able to, categorize my people, in this way. Anything that you consider would be able to do those things. So the spec, as the words that Ralph was using, is these days tends to be a lot more about outcome. It tends to be a lot more about the quality rather than listing fields and those kind of things. Great, George, next one then, please, if you don't mind.
Sure. So the next question is, what can a customer do before they select a supplier to make sure they have a successful project?
Yeah, that's one for Ralph.
I'll happily take that. There's certainly two things that we would highly encourage people to do. One is make sure that your governance structure and your internal teams are set up in advance, so that when you do select a supplier, they dovetail into it really nicely, and make sure that you've allocated the right resources with the right roles. We would hugely encourage for any project that's full digital transformation, if it involves even just your website or just your CRM, let alone both, we would strongly advise that there is a project manager in there who is if preferably dedicated, but certainly no less than 60-70% of their time allocated to it. We'd also strongly encourage a product owner as a separate role. That's the person whose job it is to understand the value that this new system will bring as an organization. And they should not be the same person as the project manager, because their job is budget and time, whereas the products owner's job is to drive value out of the requirements. And there's a conflict between those two roles, which is why we encourage them to be separate. The final thing that we would recommend is that you don't view it as a project. You need a project in order to be able to kickstart the transformation, but then you should be viewing this as a change to continuous improvement and never do another project, because that is the way that you get permanent successful change, and it becomes part of the day job just to make everything better.
Great, thank you. And actually, we've got a hand raised from one of the delegates, Jessica McElwain. Jessica, are you able to speak? Did you want to raise a question verbally? You can unmute yourself if you'd like.
Hi. No, hello everyone. No apologies. I think I clicked that in error. But no, I just wanted to say thank you very much. It's just been very, very insightful. We're just at the very beginning of our journey here in Cruise Bereavement Care, and we've just, with the help of Heart Square, have just kind of selected the vendor, and we're just about to commence the discovery phase. So it's fascinating to listen to you, Chelsea. Thank you for your time, and it's very encouraging that there is light at the end of this tunnel, that there is an end point. So thank you very much.
Jessica, apologies for me. I didn't mean to put you on the spot just because you had a bit of a mouse click. That's great. Thanks for your comment. So George, do you mind with the next question then, please?
Sure, absolutely. So the next one is, how do you instruct your team to behave with suppliers?
I wouldn't say we necessarily instructed them to behave in any particular way. Feline Soft did come in and speak to almost all teams, and I think we just encouraged them to be completely open and honest about their processes, what they did, what they wanted to achieve, and have those really open conversations. So other than that, I think it's just people generally know how to interact with one another, and we didn't have any issues there.
Great. We do find sometimes it is necessary, not at BACP, to tell clients that you've got to treat this time with suppliers seriously. We've had people, for instance, in tendering demonstrations, you know, where the suppliers are coming along and talking about the project approach and how they could do it, etc. And people are sitting there doing emails, you know, that kind of thing. It's a waste of the individual's time. You might as well not be in the room, and it's very disrespectful, and it doesn't lead to the best selection of a technology partner or the best ongoing partnership. So sometimes there are things like that we have to say, look, treat it seriously. You know, you're paying for these people's time. They are the experts. But as I say, not at BACP, but it is that meeting of equals we find to be important for the client's benefit to get the most out of that. So great, George, I think we've got a couple more.
Yeah, we've got a couple more. So the next question is, what are the most important things a customer can do during a project to help their own project?
Oh, Ralph?
Yeah, so it's a two-way relationship, I think, a project. And I would say politely but firmly holding each other to account. And there are two aspects to this. So you must understand that it's a partnership, and one of the things that we've really liked about working with BACP is it truly does feel and behave like a partnership. So we can say to BACP just as much as they can say to us, you know, you need to do that, you know, it needs to be done by this time. And that will be managed internally just as they manage us and hold us to account. So they say, no, we've got a deadline for this with this objective. You need to commit to it and produce a plan that says we can get there. And then we come back and say, yes, we can get there if you can do these bits. And sometimes what you get is you get too much of what I would call a client supplier relationship, where they could say, well, you're the supplier, you have to make everything happen. The truth of the matter is we can't. You know, we can help you with almost everything, but in the end, we can't enact the cultural change on the ground. We can stand up the software, we can train your team, but it needs to be led by people in your organization to truly make a cultural change. We can tell you how to do it, but it's a bit like the horse to water thing. So I would say that you need to ensure that the people in your organization have got the time to do the aspects of the project that your supplier needs, but also the time to do the aspects of the project that you need as an organization as well. And that really does help lead to success if you've got some real true champions that believe they own the project and the solution.
I'd add to that, actually. We had some people very close to the project manager and those involved in CRM who totally get this. And then there are some teams who I suppose are less involved. And so we had our own internal processes. So a team might say, we want X, Y, Z, and our project manager would relay that to Feline Soft, and we begin to build it. And then some teams were maybe in the habit of saying, actually, can we just add A, B, and C as well? Now, we were experienced in working with Feline Soft at this stage, so we would internally be going, no, you can't just add something. That's not how this works. This is a project that goes through scoping and planning, and Feline Soft are building you B. You can't switch to A. So we had our own sort of facilitating our own staff teams to help them understand that when you're at the point of asking for something and signing off on it, if you want to make changes after that point, there's usually going to be a cost or a time delay because you've made changes. So it was just really helping teams to understand, are you clear on what you want and signing off on it? And I would say, actually, it may be worthwhile getting teams to sign off on processes that they've asked for, that they work. One issue that we did have is sort of when we went live, some teams would say, well, this isn't what I meant it to do. And we go, well, this is what you said, and this is what you've got. But I didn't mean that. And so we internally had to get really good at holding our own teams to account.
That's a really good point. I think we've just got time for one more question, and then we have to stop, unfortunately. So you mentioned 5 years ago there was BACP, with these challenges and issues. a lot of the change hasn't been a tech project. How would you describe how BACP has changed by virtue of doing the project, by virtue of changing the way you engage with externals and how you work internally? How would you describe the organizational change?
It's been incremental, actually. I don't think we've necessarily on a daily basis noticed this huge change. But when I look back now to 5 years ago, you actually think, wow, actually, there's been a huge amount of change. We have adopted internally throughout all of our work, whether that's tech or other things, a much more agile project approach. We are better at scoping projects, delivering projects, understanding the budgets for them. And I think a lot of that is because we've invested in such a large scale project and it's worked well, that it made sense to adopt those disciplines for other projects in the organization. So I think we are much more agile, much more efficient, much more accountable in terms of knowing what we're spending and how we're spending it and what we're getting for that. And the board, I think, because they wanted reports back fairly frequently on, what's the update on CRM, what can it do now, what have we got for our money? They tend to ask those questions more generally about everything we're doing. So we've got better at reporting on our successes as well. And I think looking back, it's probably quite a different organisation to the place where it was 5 years ago. And there's a lot less paperwork around the building as well.
That's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you very much for that, Chelsea. And thank you very much, Ralph, as well, for your comments and feedback. Thanks for everybody for making the time to attend the webinar. We will be sending this out to you as a YouTube link, so you can watch the highlights. And we will also be sending you a feedback questionnaire. We don't charge for these webinars, of course, but we do like to hear how we might improve them for future. So your feedback is really welcome if you could take a few seconds to do that. So great. I'd like to thank everybody and welcome you to the next webinar that we have in a couple of weeks. So thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Cheers. Thanks.